This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the U.S.-led coalition in Afghanistan officially concluded its combat mission Sunday, 13 years after it started in 2001, ending the longest war in U.S. history, we continue speaking with Matt Akins, a journalist usually based in Kabul. He's speaking to us by Democracy Now! Video stream from Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. His recent article for Rolling Stone magazine is headlined Afghanistan, the Making of a Narco-State. Why don't you lay out for us what has happened in Afghanistan around the growing of heroin, Matt Akin?
Sure. Well, today Afghanistan produces twice as much opium as it did in the year 2000. And this spring, I traveled to Helmand province in southern Afghanistan to witness what would be the largest harvest of opium in Afghanistan's history. It's a record year. And all over the south, east, west, and north of the country, hundreds of thousands of people were taking part in this labor-intensive opium harvest. So what has happened in Afghanistan over the last 13 years has been the flourishing of a narco-state that really is without any parallel in history. It accounts for 15% of the GDP, which is more than double what cocaine accounted for at the height of Escobar-era Colombia. So this is something that's extraordinary, that's catastrophic, that has grave danger for the future, and yet there's been virtually no discussion of in recent years.
Who's growing it? Who's profiting?
Everyone is growing it. Everyone is profiting. It touches all levels of Afghan society, both sides of the conflict, the Taliban and the government. The Taliban is definitely involved. They profit by taxing the trade, by taxing growers in their areas, but the government is even more involved. Government-linked officials are believed to earn an even higher piece of revenue from the opium trade.
Talk more about the involvement of the Afghanistan government. Again, quite an amazing fact that Afghanistan provides 90% of the opium in the world.
Well, what's important to remember is the history here. So after 2001, the U.S., in its quest for vengeance against the Taliban and al-Qaeda, partnered with the very warlords whose criminality and human rights abuses had created the conditions that led to the rise of the Taliban in the first place. And in many cases, these are the same individuals who were responsible for bringing large-scale opium cultivation to Afghanistan during the war against the Soviets. When they were backed by the CIA and Pakistan's military, they became involved in heroin trafficking and opium production. So, for example, in Helmand, which is the largest opium producing province in Afghanistan, they brought back a member of the Akhundzada family. Karzai appointed him as governor. He was a key ally of the U.S. Special Forces there. And this is the same guy who had been responsible for bringing opium production to Afghanistan. So the reason that opium has flourished in Afghanistan is because we have brought in, supported, tolerated figures who are involved in very grave criminality, in human rights abuses, and in torture. And we've done this because it's been deemed militarily expedient. The generals and diplomats have decided that to pursue these narrow goals of defeating the Taliban, we needed to support these criminals.
About Marja more. Talk about it's going from being poppy-free to what it is today.
Yes, well, you probably remember Marja was the site of one of the largest battles of the war, the Battle of Marja, where the Marines air assaulted into this stretch of irrigated canal land that had actually, in a rather ironic twist of history, been built by a USAID-funded project in the 1950s and 60s. It's part of the Cold War rivalry with the Soviets. They built this huge canal irrigated zone west of Helmand that brought agriculture to the desert, and that was eventually turned into a center for poppy cultivation and a bastion of the Taliban, by the mid-2000s. So the Marines air assaulted in. There was this very televised battle. They threw the Taliban out, and for a few years the area was indeed poppy-free. But since then, as the Marines have left, as the Afghan government has become very distracted by the elections, farmers there had taken to poppy cultivation again. It was part of a general trend across the country that what small gains had been made in reducing poppy cultivation were being reversed because they had largely been driven by short-term incentives. And so I went to Marja and hung out with these farmers and saw their opium harvests. And it was really remarkable because, I was sitting in, the living room of this guy, and he brings out a basketball-sized lump of opium. And I asked him how much he was thinking he was going to sell this for. He said, he hoped to sell it for $600. And I asked him, do you know how much this would be worth on the streets of Europe? And he said he didn't. So I did a quick calculation in my head, and it worked out to over $100,000 if it was converted into heroin and sold by the gram. So, $100,000 sitting on the floor of a guy without plumbing or electricity really gives you a sense of how Afghanistan, in fact, is just at one end of this vast global economy that is the international drug trade.
You also write about the history of U.S. involvement and CIA involvement with drug traffickers in Afghanistan. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, the CIA's dirty wars that it fought in Afghanistan involved patronizing Mujahideen commanders who, in many cases, were directly involved in the narcotics trade. People like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who was responsible for the flourishing heroin laboratory scene in Pakistani tribal areas in the 1980s. Mullah Nasim Khunzada, who was I already mentioned him, major drug baron in southwestern Afghanistan. These are all people who received U.S.-supplied weaponry and funding.
And you note that the UN has estimated the Taliban makes hundreds of millions of dollars from taxing opium and other illicit activities. But in the summer of 2000, the country's fundamentalist leaders actually announced a total ban on opium cultivation. What changed?
Well, the Taliban's decision to ban poppy cultivation in 2000, which was actually remarkably successful. The only poppy that was really cultivated in the country that year was in the corner of the country still controlled by the Northern Alliance, who later became our allies. So there's still a lot of debate as to why the Taliban made that decision. Probably it was just a rash one based on ideological beliefs. They were against opium as an intoxicant being forbidden in Islam. One where they're seeking to break their international isolation and get some desperately needed development aid. But in any case, since the invasion, since the war, the Taliban, has found it expedient to become involved in not just drug trafficking, but all sorts of illicit activities, marble and timber smuggling, contraband goods. And so, yes, the Taliban and other militant groups are definitely involved in the drug trade, and that is another reason why it's so cancerous for the region. It funds all sorts of militant groups. But it shouldn't be forgotten that this is something that is as much, at the doorstep of the Afghan government as is the Taliban.
Can you tell us about Haji Lal Jan?
Yeah, Haji Lal Jan is an interesting case. It really highlights the limitations of the approach that we've tried to take to opium there. The U.S. had been supporting the specialized counter-narcotics unit within the Ministry of the Interior in the hopes that this would provide the seed for Afghan efforts to go after drug trafficking, because there was sort of a decision made at the interagency level not to directly prosecute corrupt Afghan officials because that would be too harmful to our war effort. So the hope was the Afghans would do it themselves. And in 2012, this major drug kingpin. He had been designated as a foreign narcotics kingpin by President Obama, but he had been living openly in Kandahar for many years, allegedly under the protection of President Karzai's powerful half-brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai. So he was actually arrested by this Afghan commando unit with international advisors. He allegedly, according to court documents and prosecutors that I spoke to, he managed to escape when the raid was happening, went nearby, placed a call to Kandahar's governor, Turial Wisa, on the phone. Wisa, again, allegedly, according to the wiretaps, told him that just to sit tight and he would call President Karzai and see what was happening. They did, then based on that phone call, they tracked him to a second location, got him. He was taken to Kabul and put in the special counter-narcotics court where he was successfully prosecuted, convicted, it went to the appeals court. He was given 20 years in prison. And then a sort of chain of events occurred that for many people highlighted just how deeply the narcotics industry reaches, the highest levels of the executive and judicial branches. At the Supreme Court, his sentence was reduced to 15 years in prison. He was then transferred, after an order from the presidential palace, back to Kandahar to serve his time there. In Kandahar prison, a local court based on an outdated provision in the Afghan criminal code that allowed for release for good behavior after 9 months for sentences that were 15 years or less, ordered him to be released on parole. He immediately fled across the border to Pakistan. So it certainly seemed to many observers like an orchestrated conspiracy to free a notorious and powerful drug trafficker who, again, allegedly was making payments, both the Afghan government and the Taliban, in order to facilitate his heroin business.
Do you see the opium economy changing with the U.S.'s changing role, though it certainly hasn't pulled out entirely?
Unfortunately, it seems like it's just increasing year after year. And at this point, given how catastrophically things have gone, I mean, of course, opium was a deeply entrenched problem in Afghanistan in the year 2001. But for it to have gotten twice as bad would require some remarkable failures in policy over the last 13 years. So given that we've gotten to that point, any gains, any reductions in poppy cultivation will be incremental and long-term. It should be remembered that, one, Afghan farmers only touch 1% of the value of the global opium trade. This is a world problem. This has to do with the fact that the world millions of people desire to consume illegal drugs. We've made that illegal and waged a war against it. So there will always be narco-states like Afghanistan under such a system. And two, there are huge segments of the Afghan population whose human security is dependent on poppy. These are impoverished farmers in many cases, and if we pursue some brutal campaign of eradication against them, it's going to immiserate the rural population.
Well, Matt, I want to thank you for being with us. George Polk Award-winning journalist, usually based in Kabul, joining us now from Halifax, Nova Scotia in Canada. We'll link to your recent piece in Rolling Stone, Afghanistan, the Making of a Narco-State.